It's always great to have community, but at the same time, like nobody can walk your path but you. And so you might be that person who breaks new ground.
Hi, Disha.
Hey, Donnie.
And welcome, everyone, to Ursa's Short Fiction, the podcast where we geek out on our favorite short stories. I'm Donnie Walton, author of The Final Revival of Opal and Nev.
And I'm Disha Philyaw, author of The Secret Lives of Church Ladies.
As always, this show is produced with support from you. Become an Ursa member today by going to ursastory.com/join. You'll get exclusive bonus episodes, and you'll help fund future stories and conversations. Today, we're excited to welcome Jonathan Escoffery to the podcast. He is the author of the 2022 linked story collection, If I Survive You, which was a New York Times and Booklist editor's choice, an IndieNext pick, and a national bestseller. The collection was longlisted for the National Book Award, the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence, the Aspen Words Literary Prize, the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize, and the Penn Gene Stein Book Award, and is a finalist for the Southern Book Prize and the California Bookseller Alliance's Golden Poppy Award. It has been named a best or most anticipated book by The New Yorker, The New York Times, NPR, Entertainment Weekly, People, Time, Oprah Daily, GQ, and elsewhere. Whew. In 2020, Jonathan received the Paris Review's Plimpton Prize for Fiction and a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. He is a Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. And Disha, gosh, I just love so much of what Jonathan said in the interview. I mean, we've talked about these stories at such wonderful depth, and really, I feel like, get a sense of his thought process as he was going through them. And really not so much a thought process, but just coming to these characters as a storyteller first and foremost is something he was expressing to us. But we're getting all these ideas and themes and like provocations from the stories, which I love.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned on the show, Jonathan and I are both Kimbilio Fiction Fellows. So we met in 2017, and he was just sort of this quiet presence, at least, you know, from my perspective. And then I read this absolutely electric collection of stories. And so I couldn't wait to talk to him, you know, what was going on in that mind. He's just such a fantastic storyteller. And I just appreciated in our conversation that he gave us a glimpse into, you know, his process and his confidence as, you know, I can tell you through these stories about what it's like to be a Jamaican American man in Miami, and, you know, through the lens of these relationships between this father and two sons over, you know, the span of many years. And I just really enjoyed hearing the way that he approaches, you know, characters as well as character development in this kind of organic way. You know, we talked to him about themes, and he said, you know, the themes are kind of there, but I'm really, you know, thinking about what these characters are doing and what they're showing me. And so I just appreciated that.
So great. And another great example of a, you know, writer who has been doing it for years, you know. I mean, you look at this book and it's got so many awards and acclaim and buzz. I mean, I feel like I was reading about this book months before it was out, which is really, really rare for a story collection. And yet the story is that Jonathan has been working on this book for so long. And it's a real testament to patience, to, you know, faith in yourself as a writer, and to not being so wrapped up in the publication process, but knowing yourself as a writer and knowing you have a story to tell, which is super inspiring.
That's right. And this notion that short stories don't sell. And, you know, our whole podcast just defies that because all we're talking to are writers whose, you know, collections have succeeded and have dazzled. And so, you know, Jonathan is among those I'm going to boldly say are out here changing the game.
Yes. It is a time for the short story, and Jonathan is definitely at the forefront of that. We get pretty spoilery with the stories here, so if you haven't listened to Jonathan's story Under the Ackee Tree, go do that, then come back here for the deep dive. And with all that out of the way, here is our conversation with Jonathan Escoffery. Jonathan Escoffery, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you both.
Woo, we got some questions. I mean, this was such a provocative collection. That's the word that occurred to me before I hopped on this call, was basically there's so many things to talk about in this book. And we just, Disha and I have this Google document we share, and like, it's just like questions.
Yeah.
So we're so excited. But I want to start with the story that we're actually featuring, which is called Under the Ackee Tree, which was such a beautiful story, very voice-driven and very emotional. And my first question is, the final moments of conflict between the father character, Topper, and Trelawney, who, the collection follows Trelawney's journey throughout the stories. The conflict that the father and son have at the end of that story has repercussions through the rest of the book, particularly the scene in which Topper calls Trelawney, quote, defective. And I gasped when I read that word, and I felt so cut on Trelawney's behalf. And it made me think about how artfully writers have to handle big dramatic moments like this, because it's such a powerful moment. And I thought it was masterful how you put so much into that single word choice. So my question is, how did you come to choose that as the word that would sort of cut Trelawney so deeply and haunt the rest of these stories? And did you play with having Topper say different things or phrases, or was it always that one word?
As I recall, I believe I came to that word first, but I'd written much of the story collection by the time I had kind of come to that moment in that story. Under the Ackee Tree was... I was basically writing Under the Ackee Tree and then the title story at the same time. And those were the last two stories that I wound up writing for the collection.
Wow.
And so I knew that something was kind of simmering in this relationship between Topper and Trelawney. And at a certain point, I had to kind of ask myself, like, what exactly is the tension between father and son here? And what, from Topper's perspective, is his problem with Trelawney? And I think it's, as somebody who maybe relates more to Trelawney and has a kind of life trajectory that runs more parallel to Trelawney, it's easier for me to imagine the different criticisms that he has for his father. But from the father's perspective, I really had to step into Topper's shoes and think about what it is that has maybe disappointed him in terms of his son and the way his son either moves through the world, or also the way the son is kind of casting back a kind of disappointment in terms of the life choices that Topper has made, including that decision, along with Sonia, to move the family from Kingston, Jamaica to Miami, Florida. And to me, it seemed like that word defective was what Topper was kind of grappling with. He seems, Trelawney knows he doesn't fit, and he feels he doesn't fit within the family. He feels he doesn't really fit in this country that he's been born into, the United States. But Topper seems to think that it should have been easier for Trelawney. And we have the older brother, Delano, kind of created against Trelawney, where Delano, at least for a time growing up, he finds an easier time of things. I mean, he also emigrates to the U.S., but he finds it easier to adjust. And for some reason, Trelawney does not. And perhaps that's because he doesn't have that same claim to his family culture, which is the Jamaican culture. And I think there's I think there's a lot that could be unpacked about that word. But I also just thought, wow, like, what a hurtful thing. And I think also it might have been one of those moments where he hadn't yet called him anything. And by the time you get to the very end of that story, I knew what image I wanted to land on. And I think it's okay at this point in the life of the book to say what happens at the end of the story, which is that Trelawney responds to being called defective by attempting to chop down his father's beloved Ackee tree. His father puts most of his post-retirement time into taking care of his garden in this dream home that he's built for himself, and that Ackee tree that he feels like represents his ability to have allowed his legacy to survive after that move from Jamaica to the US. And Trelawney is attempting to kind of say otherwise and end that legacy for Topper. But that was something where I thought it was a really powerful image to land on, but I needed to earn it. I needed to earn that kind of what's going to make a son go to that extent to get back at his father. Or Topper doesn't think Trelawney understands the significance of the Ackee tree to Jamaicans and to Topper specifically. And Trelawney is picking up that axe and he's saying, no, I know the exact significance, and I'm going to show you that by ending this thing.
I felt so called out in the scene where Topper serves his son's Ackee for the first time, and Trelawney says, it looks like scrambled eggs, because the first time I had Ackee, that's what I thought. And I was like, oh gosh, such an American response.
It is. It's an American response, and it's probably the response I had when my parents first served me Ackee and saltfish. It's like once you have a intimate relationship with the meal, it's like, oh, of course it's not scrambled eggs, but from afar, when you're first encountering it, that would be our first point of comparison, I think, as particularly as Americans.
Yep.
I still haven't had Ackee, so I know, shame on me. I live in New York City. I need to go somewhere.
I was going to say, maybe you have an excuse because you're in a region in the country where it's hard to find, but no. And in New York City, you can actually get really good Ackee and really good Jamaican food, period.
Well, you have to text me later and tell me where I should go. Exactly.
Right, I will.
I find it fascinating, Jonathan, that this was one of the last stories you said you wrote for the collection, because it does have such repercussions for the rest of the stories. And so I'm wondering, just in general, how this collection came into the world, how it came together. And was this sort of like one of the final pieces you need to kind of make everything cohere?
Yeah, I think at a certain point, I wanted to actually just come out and say certain things that had again been in the back of my mind as the author of this story, or maybe had been a little bit existing between the lines of some of the other stories. I knew I wanted for this falling out to take place between father and son. I knew that I wanted more of an exploration of this family's Jamaicanness and what it meant for them to emigrate, and what it meant for them to either, kind of hang on to the culture or not, or explore what it means for that culture to be handed down from one generation to the next, and explore what might get in the way of that culture being handed down to the next, or even exploring the idea of whether it's worth it, whether it's a good thing, what's the value of continuing the culture once Trelawney's born in the U.S. He's American. He could just say, that was my parents' thing and not mine. But so I wanted to explore some of those questions, and I really never thought that I was going to be writing from Topper's perspective. I never thought I was going to bring the parents' perspective into this. I really thought it was just going to be Trelawney's story altogether. But then Trelawney's kind of critical of his older brother, so I thought, well, if he's most critical of him, I wanted Delano to get his say. And, it seemed in a way only fair to me that the brother got to share some of his points of views. And so the Delano story entered the book. And then similarly with Topper, with the biggest tension, I think, in the book in terms of characters. If, maybe one of the biggest tensions in the book is Trelawney versus, I don't know, society or something like that. But in terms of the human beings as they're represented on the page, him and his father have that major tension. And I thought I had already been exploring that from Trelawney's point of view. And I thought, what about, because Topper is going to have his own point of view clearly, and he is going to, it's not that the story is meant to say, well, if you look at it from this side, Topper doesn't do anything wrong. Like that's not what I meant to explore. But I also thought if we're going to look at, topics like immigration and, what it means for this Jamaican family to try to survive in the US, like why not actually start the story in Jamaica? And that's a part of Trelawney's story, but that isn't really his central story since he wasn't born there. And so I decided to kind of back the timeline up to the 1960s where Topper is growing up, and he believes he has, as a middle-class Jamaican, he believes he has all of these options. And then, he starts to build a family and get older. And as we get older, it can seem like our options are becoming more limited because we've already made so many choices in our lives and mistakes, and we have to kind of live through the consequences of those choices and mistakes. And that's where the end of the story leads us with Topper and Trelawney.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to talk about Trelawney a little bit. This is the character we sort of follow throughout the collection. And I really loved the ending notes of the collection, the title story. And we come to understand that you, and If I Survive You, is partly also, I believe, a younger version of Trelawney himself, being addressed by an older version at some later point in time. And that made me wonder if you have a vision of how and where Trelawney ends up off the page.
Not too specific, but what I noticed about Trelawney is that I didn't want a character who was just going to be completely the victim of circumstance and, someone without agency who was just going to be the recipient of, institutions such as racism. I wanted him to be also creating some of his own trouble, because to me, those are the most interesting stories, is when the conflict is coming out of the character. And also I wanted to show he's, if I'm trying to make him feel like a real human being, and people of color and immigrants, and, especially if you're coming from an island in the Caribbean, that sometimes, when you ask people, there's actually a moment in the book where Trelawney says explicitly, when you say Jamaica to non-Jamaicans, they give you this list of things that they know about Jamaica, and they list sandals and tourism and poverty, poor people. And I think quietly in there's also this idea of like servitude, of Jamaicans existing to serve colonial desire at an all-inclusive resort or something like that. And so it was very important to me that I didn't create these kind of flat victim characters. And as such, I had an idea of Trelawney kind of internalizing some of these earlier questions that he's asked about his identity, his ethnic identity, racial identity, and having him start to, I don't know, create problems out of that as he internalizes that. And so towards the end, for me, I was thinking with the title story, he has finally, in a way, he's put a roof back over his head in a sense. He has a job. He has this goal. He's ambivalent about his goal, but he has this goal of buying the family home and proving that his father bet on the wrong son. And he's going to kind of make himself whole again by purchasing this house. And something I was thinking about is that he doesn't have to take that weird job that he finds on the internet on Craigslist to show up and watch a wealthy white couple have sex. And, and obviously that job kind of evolves into weirder things. He doesn't have to do that at that point. Maybe we see him pick up odd jobs earlier in the story, and he's living out of his car, and he's literally starving, and he's sleep deprived, and maybe one could make the argument that he shows up for that job because he absolutely has to for his own survival. But towards the end, I wanted him to not have to harm himself and still make that choice to put himself in harm's way kind of multiple times over. And so when we're looking at the ending, when he's talking to himself, I think it's just that he's recognizing these patterns within himself and that he has been setting himself on a path towards destruction. And, you know, whether his father is the one who started that kind of pattern or not, it's really up to him to break out of it as an adult who is really only going to harm himself, or at least harm himself most directly if he doesn't break out of these patterns. And so, I mean, that's kind of the point I was writing from. But I mean, I think it's still a point of like anxiety. So it's like you could imagine that he he has possibly already gotten himself into even more trouble at the time that he's talking to his younger self and trying to, you know, convince himself to stop this stuff, stop this pattern, stop this nonsense.
Yeah.
But, you know, I don't think I thought much more specific than that. I did think there was a kind of, I don't know, maybe limited opportunity for him to make that change, and possibly a limited opportunity to repair what's been damaged in his relationship with his father.
Well, I felt hopeful for Trelawney, and I think that the self-awareness is like half the battle. Like understanding what
right.
what your issues are, what your problems are, is a big part of doing better. So I think Trelawney is hopefully thriving out in the world.
I'm rooting for him.
I love to hear you say that, because not everybody has gotten the hopeful bit part of the ending, and maybe that has to do with the life you've lived, that your lived experience that you're bringing to the book.
And I want to talk about how all of these stories came together, and also just even how you conjured this family, these brothers and this father. And I do have a specific question about the first story in the collection, In Flux. But could you talk a bit about when did you know you were building a collection, and when did these characters first come to you?
I was applying to MFA programs in fall of 2010. And I had my 10 schools that I'd chosen, and I was working on the application, and I was meeting with 2 of my closest writer friends every week. We all had the same goal of leaving Miami and going away to grad school. And we would workshop our stories, and I'd been workshopping 2 other stories, and I really thought I had my writing sample together. But about maybe 3 weeks before the first deadline, I sat down to write, and I wrote this very short, maybe 5-page version of a story that was told from Trelawney's point of view in his voice, and he was living with Delano. I don't think they had names yet, but he was very frustrated with his brother, and things were falling down in the house. And so we kind of see that dynamic towards the end of the book, but it's not a story that actually made it into the book. And I felt like I wanted to explore an idea of impossible situations, such as when you have a family where there's a kind of clear family favorite, and what happens when the family favorite starts to fall down on his responsibilities, and what happens when the parent figure won't actually act, when the parent figure fails to step in and take action. And again, like trying to see everybody's point of view, I thought that would be very difficult for a topper to evict his own son and put his son out in the street, except that, after following these characters for a while, you come to learn that, or I discovered through spending time with these characters, that Topper kicks his younger son, out into the street. And so I thought that would be an even more hurtful thing when Delano is falling down on all these responsibilities and Topper won't do anything about it, even though he absolutely did something about it when it was Trelawney's turn to make the mistakes. So I wound up writing that story and submitting that to a bunch of MFA programs, and wound up at the University of Minnesota. And for a time, I thought that story was actually something like an opening chapter to a novel. And I kept trying to write forward from that story. And it really, the more I thought of it as a novel, the more it wouldn't go anywhere, the more it wouldn't work out. Like I couldn't write. I was giving myself I guess people say writer's block. I was thinking more like stage fright on the page. It was a kind of humorous story, like there was a kind of biting humor. And I thought, well, how do you sustain that? I'd never written a book yet, so I didn't know how I was going to sustain the humor. I think I was overthinking things like, it's got to be a funny book or it's got to be this kind of book. And so I just had to take a step back and started exploring these characters through these stories, kind of one story at a time. But, it's not as simple as me thinking it's a novel and then deciding it's stories. I would write a few stories, and as the stories started to be in conversation with each other, I started to put the book back together and think, well, no, it kind of is a novel. There's novelesque. And then, I would decide otherwise. So I kind of went back and forth for years. But I started to, there were times where I was exploring, obviously, like the same family, the same characters, but I hadn't quite figured out what the larger arc of the book was going to be. And that was where, again, working on those final two stories, Under the Ackee Tree and If I Survive You, really helped me hammer out what's the arc, what's Trelawney's individual character arc, and how has his relationship with each of his family members changed throughout the book, and what's going to be like satisfying ways to explore these threads and conclude these threads. And you'd asked about In Flux. When I wrote In Flux, I think that's when I really started to see it, like not just like a book because I want to have written a book. I think that's where I kind of started. But when I wrote In Flux, I thought, oh, this is the beginning of your book. And now you actually have direction and momentum and a kind of shape for this world, or at least the beginnings of a shape for this world that you're creating. And so that was a big discovery for me, in discovering that we would meet Trelawney at a much younger age than I had originally been exploring him.
You mentioned that you started the process of writing this collection in 2010 as you were applying for MFA programs. The book was released in 2022, so that's a 12-year span. And that's significant because I think sometimes people don't understand how long books take. And then I think you may have heard this, as many of us have, from people who go through MFA programs. Some people come out feeling this urgency that as soon as they graduate, they've got to have a book out or be working towards getting a book out in the world immediately. And I'm just curious if you felt that pressure at all, or, what did you tell yourself about the process and how long it should take?
I absolutely felt the pressure. I mean, if upon graduation day, if someone said, we'll give you a book deal, but you've got to cut your left-hand thumb off, I might have taken the offer, to be honest. Like I felt enormous pressure to, prove that I was a writer, or that the last 3 years had been spent well. I was someone who graduated college as a non-traditional student. So I was older. I was almost 30 when I graduated from college. And I'd spent a lot of time exploring things that weren't having to do with my education or my literary career before college. And then so I think the point I'm trying to get to is that going to do my MFA, it almost felt like it was this correction, and I was finally on the right path. And for that to be, for the possibility of my MFA not having actually put me on the right path, that possibility really frightened me. And there was also just this difficult thing that, I mean, you've asked the question, and you clearly know that it's hard when you exit those programs, especially if you are like me, then you go to a program like that and it gives you a kind of source of pride. It gives you a bit of a sense that you're not only are you investing in yourself as a writer, but this is. It's a little bit of a validation, and sometimes we take that way too far. But I graduated, and all of the professors, the shout out to U of M faculty, they all said you're not going to have a book when you graduate. And one of the problems was that one of the more recent graduates did have a book when he graduated, and
Okay.
and I think, and, and he got like a really big deal, and it was kind of like, well, if he's the exception, and I feel I'm exceptional at writing, blah 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 blah, and you tell yourself these things, and kind of focus on all the wrong things versus developing your writing and your practice and and possibly your project. But I always think, it's more than about just one project. I think that's something I didn't quite. I grasped it, but I wouldn't believe myself if I told myself that. It's like if I were to tell a younger version of myself, take your time. And it's not about just, the one book. It's like, shut up, because you older self have a book. So, it's like, it's easy to say once you actually achieve the thing, that it's not that serious. But I graduated. I started sending stories out. That maybe, some of them should have been published and some of them shouldn't have. I don't know. There was just an enormous amount of pressure. But I think the other aspects or the other angle of it is just like, okay, I went to a fully residential MFA program where we TA'd and we had a stipend, and it was a tiny stipend. But at the time, living in Minneapolis, you could live on a shoestring. And after graduation, it kind of hits you like, oh, well, what can I do though now? How could I actually support myself and live? And, it seemed like I had been working towards a degree that was going to be worth something and meant something. And then the rest of the world stepping off campus, the rest of the world was kind of saying like, what's your MFA worth? Like, why do we care? What can you actually do that's going to make you an employee that we're going to invest in and give a paycheck to, and clearly, they're not offering you. Universities are not showing up at your MFA graduation saying, "Hey, here's your tenure track position."
Right.
New writer who has no publication record.
Here come an adjunct for peanuts.
Exactly. And I did the math on that, and I saw, I spoke to my adjunct friends and colleagues, and it just even if I was lucky, I mean, I shouldn't say lucky, but even if I could get it, it's just like I didn't see how I was going to survive on that. And so, yeah, there was pressure from kind of all angles, because there was a real world pressure of like, how do you survive now? But then there was also the pressure I put on myself that was like, you need to prove that you're a writer, and the way you prove that is through publications and moving towards the book and getting the book out as soon as possible. And it wasn't all just in my head, because when you talk to people who maybe aren't writers, or even some people who are writers, as those years go by, as you mentioned, it was that's 12 years between starting the project and having the book come out. There's a lot of voices saying, hey, but what is taking you so long? How come you don't have a book if you've been working on it so long? And so, yeah, I don't know, it's a lot. It's stressful just to put myself back in those shoes. Right. I might be finding myself in fetal position any moment now.
So, okay, well, we'll shift gears then to my question about influx. This is when at the first story in the collection, we meet Treylani as a young boy, and you show us his confusion in this quest to understand his identity, answering the question, the perennial question, what are you? And this is happening as his family is falling apart, which we talked about a little bit, and as they literally and figuratively are picking up the pieces after a Hurricane Andrew. And this boy's grasping in what felt to me like this quiet devastation in the face of racism and bullying and ultimately abandonment from his father. All of that really hit me, even though I didn't share his particular experiences when I was growing up in Florida. But the way you write those really awkward, really lonely times, I felt that. And I remembered things from my own childhood. And so I was in conversation with some other writers recently, and one of them said that they don't write children characters because they are too far removed from the experience of childhood themselves. But on the contrary, children are my favorite characters to write. And so I wondered if you could talk a bit about your process and approach to writing young characters.
Ooh, that's a good question. I think, I wanted to allow for a lot of other voices around Trelawney to be saying these characters, these voices that say, "What are you?" Or even, he's confused the first time he hears it, and subsequent times as well. But he tries different answers as he's growing up, and I wanted to be able to show how following the thread of those questions of how he might answer and how others might deny him his ability to self-identify or throw I guess skepticism his way. I wanted to show how that would actually evolve. And so, part of me was just showing how it felt for him kind of impossible to fit or give the right answer. And I think if his answers were accepted, he would be very happy just to be included in whatever group that would kind of have him as a kind of survival strategy. I think, for him, I think I felt this a bit growing up, that middle school and high school could be difficult if you don't have your people, whatever,
right.
whatever that means to you in terms of people. That could be just clicks or however it is. And my recollection of growing up in Miami, which is this, such a multicultural place, like people want to know how to categorize you, to know whether or not you fit within their group or not. And I just kind of wanted to show the evolution of that question, and also move Trelawney from a point where he's the kind of passive recipient of all that's happening around him, including his parents' inability or maybe their refusal to help clear any of this up. Because when he's, "What are you?" is cast his way, he repeats that to his mother, and she says, "You're a little of this and you're a little of that," and he understands like that's not really going to work out in the world that he's found himself in. But as he gets older, so I see influx. I can't even remember if I had it operate as I think I originally had like a part 1, part 2, and part 2 would have been when he went away to college. And so, it's in college, I feel like he starts to participate in some of this stuff a little bit more actively. And so some of the conclusions that he's drawing, or some of the questions that he himself starts asking, I as the author, I don't always agree with where Trelawney is. It's like he's doing the math and the the answer he comes to, it's like he can read the equation, but he's coming to like some interesting places. And I wanted to show, it's not just society, because we have a Delano on the other hand who's not so bothered by any of these questions, and one can kind of imagine that he's probably fielding some of that as well, but he's just kind of like gonna shrug and move on with life. And Trelawney is someone who's gonna really obsess over these things. And at the same time, I think it's maybe even more important that it comes across that if he's confused, it's not just because he's a dumb, confused person. Like, this is society is saying all of these very contradictory things. And in order to be well adjusted, quote unquote, it's like you have to pretend society makes sense. Society as we've constructed it, or these different categories as we've constructed them, that they're like perfect. And the more you play ignorant to that, the better your outcomes seem to be. But Trelawney, it's like he's smart enough to understand that they don't fit, but he's not in a position at that earlier stage of the book where he can set those questions aside and move forward in a healthy way, I think.
So one of the standout stories for me in this collection was Splashdown. And it stood out to me because it's sort of different from the other stories in that we drift away a bit from this nuclear family, and we follow a cousin of Trelawney and Delano's named, is it Cookie or Cookie?
Cookie.
Cookie. And we follow Cookie attempting to establish a relationship with his biological dad, who ends up being very shady. And I kept reading the ending over and over, Jonathan, sort of hoping for a different outcome. Like, please tell me this doesn't happen. But I was curious, because it is so different from the other stories, why you felt it was important to include that one in this collection.
It was a story that, honestly, I took it out, I put it back in, took it out, put it back in. Ultimately, I was thinking about these father-son dynamics and what lessons are passed down from one generation to the next and how we might break some of these cycles of dysfunction. And I wanted to, thinking about where Trelawney and Topper end up at the end of the book. Trelawney, in a sense, he puts himself in a bad situation and then asks his father to get him out of it, in a sense. And I saw Splashdown as operating as this kind of parallel narrative where the stakes are much higher in terms of, or, they're more immediate and physically in a physically observable way. The stakes are higher. But I wanted to explore those parallels, and I felt that the book could really use that, where we have, Topper in a sense does abandon his son for a while, but he's also there at the beginning, and they do have that nuclear family for a bit. And I wanted to explore what that would be like for the character who doesn't have his father to begin with, and that initial pain and injury. I wanted to explore what it would look like for them to actually get past that and start to build a relationship. And to me, there's always that question that Cookie has, which is, he has a couple of questions. He asks, what kind of man is my father? And he has that moment where he imagines himself sinking to I should say he has that moment where Topper takes him out into the ocean. He takes him out on his boat. He wants to teach him how to catch lobster. And Cookie has a moment where he imagines himself sinking to the ocean floor just to see if Ox, his father, will rescue him. And I think that desire to see whether or not his father will rescue him is what we see in his story at the end of that story, and what we're also seeing in Trelawney at the end of the book. And so I wanted to explore those parallels, or, once I had explored those parallels, I thought they really worked well together, especially with Splashdown coming right about midway through the book.
Right.
So I think this is a good segue into a two-part question that I have, and that is about masculinity as a theme that I observed running through the collection. And thinking of another example of when Topper refers to his Uncle Michael as soft more than once in Under the Ackee Tree. That's something that kind of jumped out at me. And I was wondering if the focus on masculinity was a conscious or subconscious craft choice on your part. That's part one of my question. And given that there's so much current discourse about toxic masculinity specifically, I'm curious how readers have responded to this theme and to your characters as they grapple with these notions of masculinity.
Yeah, this is one of those really harder questions for me, because when I think of masculinity, I'm not always sure what we're talking about, or what the parameters.
None of us are, right? Right? That's the thing, right?
Right.
Yeah. It's like it's easier to point out when you add the toxic part, because it's like, okay, now we have certain behaviors where we can say, this is something that particularly traditionally it's been men have passed down these certain. They've done these actions, but they've also introduced them into society as the things that are supposedly natural and naturally associated with men, with manhood, with masculinity. But I can't really write from a point of, I guess, like topics. Even as I knew, I was definitely exploring father-son relationships and difficult dynamics between fathers and sons. I'm glad you pointed out the part where Uncle Michael is called soft. I think there are other, ideas that are definitely explicitly kind of meant to be bad ideas that that fathers have in this book, or Topper has in particular, when he talks about what makes a man is his testicles, basically, when the boys hop into the car to decide whether or not to take the family dog to get neutered. And I think it's a clear moment where I see Trelawney understanding that this is not the kind of man he wants to grow up into, and yet his brother seems to, in a sense, accept that lesson, and it's almost in that accepting of the lesson that draws him into being more of a man as his father has defined it. And so their relation, like, they're tighter for it. And so Trelawney tries to pretend he believes such a thing, but it's his bucking the, I guess, toxic masculinity that is leaving him on the outs with his family, or it's contributing to that. And so I think I was taking it, that exploration of masculinity, like, moment by moment, rather than trying to come to any particularly large conclusions, because I'm still, I'm still figuring some of these things out. And then when it comes to, like, the more what we might say about what's positive about masculinity as we've thought about it, what's the value, what do we keep? Oftentimes it's like, I don't know if we want those things to be associated, like, with masculinity. It's like, if we say leadership is a masculine trait, I've heard people say that a lot, and it's like, but is that where we want to land? That
right?
It's, you know what I mean? I don't think that is where we want to land. And so it's just like, every time I'm picking apart the positives, I could absolutely attribute that across genders, and it's a difficult one for me.
Well, and I think that's the strength of so many of the stories, is that, as a writer, of course, we're reading it with kind of, two minds for the enjoyment of it, and this, and as Donnie mentioned earlier, the provocation, but also, reading from a craft perspective. And I can, as a writer, I can see you doing different things, but what I really appreciated is that your focus, to me, seemed to be on telling the best and most interesting story you could tell, and not, I am going to, I'm going to conjure up these emotions, or I'm trying to stir this up, or I'm trying to stir this point. Your gifts as a storyteller were just so evident on the page, and I just really appreciate that.
Thank you. I mean, that's the highest compliment, I think. I think if we lived in a perfect world, I would still, I could still imagine myself as a storyteller, meaning, like, I want to tell a good story kind of first, and then, grapple with these other things. Racism is a major source of conflict in the book, but if somehow there were no racism, or, if I had only ever been in a place that had exactly one race, and we never had to even think about, what race we had, then I would still be wanting to tell great stories. And for me, as the artist, as the storyteller, you're looking for your content and what's going to be worthy of exploration, but in a way that, is engaging, if not entertaining. I think engaging first. But as a writer, I write to entertain myself to some extent, just as a necessity to actually finish anything. I have to be entertained on some level. And I think that's where some of the humor comes in there, because it's like, sometimes I just want, I want to laugh too, even as I deal with these grim moments. It's like, I also want to laugh. And if it's all just, a grim telling of this character who lives in his car, it's going to depress me to the point where I won't want to show back up to my computer the next morning to finish the book.
So we've talked a lot about the men in the collection, but there are many fascinating women in the stories, and kind of hovering around the edges. And I was so curious about Sonia, who is the mother in this little nuclear unit. I was so curious about her and her life as she moves back home. Did you ever think that you would maybe write about Sonia? Was that ever part of the collection? Or did you always sort of know this is a book about men and sort of their relationships with women are part of it, but not really, I'm not going to do like the perspective?
I have a story. I have multiple stories that I've been trying to write about Sonia. And I thought there would be a Sonia story at one point. I mean, again, just to walk you through the process, I thought it would be only Trelawney for a time. And then I thought, okay, it's going to be these brothers. And then once I realized Under the Ackee Tree was actually needed to be told from Topper's perspective, I thought, oh, damn, now I brought the parents into this. So now, is it going to feel uneven and with not having a Sonia story? And I don't know, like part of me, I realized I'd been working on this like father-son thing. I didn't want to just kind of throw in a Sonia story out of like obligation. I really love that character and I didn't want like a throwaway story. It's kind of mean to say maybe, but like sometimes I've read collections where there seems to be like, I don't know, we're trying out another gender on the page, and I didn't want it to come across that way, which is not to say. So there's a version that kind of lives in my head where I absolutely nailed it, and I nailed the Sonia story, and it works within the context of the rest of the book. I even had thoughts like maybe a Sonia story makes it into the paperback.
Ooh.
And I guess that's if I write faster or revise faster, maybe. But I mean, another way to look at it though is, just depending on what kind of book it is that you're writing. For me, a lot of these stories, they feel like, to me, it's like I'm telling you what it's like to live in the skin of a Jamaican American who grew up in Miami and has had certain experiences. And, it is fiction, but a lot of this is informed by my lived experience. And I thought, if I'm bringing that in all these other stories, and then I have a story that's to me, it's going to stand out as not my lived in the skin. Maybe because maybe I'm not talented enough, or maybe I don't know what it is to be a woman in the world. And I can research it, and I can do my best kind of idea of a representation of it. But for me, and maybe it has to do with all of our conversations about who can write what these days.
Yeah.
There's definitely a kind of anxiety around that. But there's part of me that believes even if I did a great job, it's like I kind of want the great Miami Jamaican American woman writer to write not Sonia's story, but I want her to tell us what it's like to be a Jamaican American woman or a Jamaican woman who's moved her family to Miami. And I do believe I will be putting out stories from Sonia's perspective. Well, I don't think like the takeaway or my goal is going to be, I know better than every single other person what it is to be a Jamaican American woman. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I can step confidently into pretty much any room and say, nobody knows more than me what it's like to be a Jamaican American man who grew up in Miami. Even if you are a Jamaican American man who grew up in Miami, you don't know it more than me. You might know it as much as me. And that's kind of what I wanted this book to leave. That's like the mark I wanted to leave with this book.
And what I hear you saying is, in this larger question of who gets to write about whom, is not being overconfident and not wanting to do any kind of harm. And I think it was Toni Morrison or someone that said it's not about having that character's experience, but having empathy,
Yeah.
But I will say that there were two things about that Sonia that, stood out to me and that make me confident in your Sonia story. And it was when she explains that her going back to Jamaica and she's tired of taking care of men. And she says, and who takes care of me? That rang so true. Yeah. And then, initially, and we always tell our listeners that there are spoilers. Here's a spoiler. Initially, because of the sequence of the stories, we believe that Topper has just decided to leave with his older son and leave Trelawney with Sonia. We find out that Sonia forced him to choose, to split, pick a boy,
Right.
pick a son. Devastating.
Yeah.
And so I went through such a cycle of emotions as a mother myself when I read that she was the one that made the decision, because I just thought Topper was all kinds of assholes for her, when I thought it was him. And then when I realized that Sonia made it, I was like, yeah, because her point was, you're not going to just leave and leave me with all of these responsibilities of both children.
Mm-hmm.
And that felt right to me too. So for whatever it's worth, as you're writing here.
Even though she doesn't have a story, she is wonderfully complex. She is so interesting. And I really was sort of cheering for her when she went back to Jamaica. She's like, I'm about to live the rest of my life, like in exactly the way I want to. Yeah.
Right. And I think from a narrative perspective, I mean, there's, if she doesn't make that decision for herself, and I'm not saying there couldn't be a story that followed. I mean, I've actually, we could have followed her to Jamaica. So there is that, but I felt like she would save Chilani. The other men in his family, that I think that's the question. Like, will his father step up and show up for him? I don't think that's ever really a question for Sonia. Or there's even the moment where he's working in the elderly housing, low income apartment building, and he's sleeping in the beds of the tenants who have died. And he knows that if he receives a call from his mother, he's going to have to lie and say that everything's okay and he's not living out of his car, because he knows that if he actually says that, it's going to put that burden on her to actually save him. And he doesn't want to put her in that position. And so, I mean, to me, she's very much a part of the heart of everything that's going on, as we continue to see her either through the more retrospective stories or via these phone calls. But yeah, I was rooting for her to not be sunk by these men's bad decisions, and she also gets to, I guess another spoiler is she gets to put her Learn Italian Now tapes to work when she goes to Italy. So she gets to have that dream of traveling.
Team Sonia.
Yes.
So, Donnie, I promise I won't hog the conversation. I have another question. Because I want to follow up to what you were saying, Jonathan, when I asked about the pressure to publish. And I just want to clarify that I wasn't suggesting, oh my God, what took you 12 years? Because as somebody who, wrote for 20 years before my collection came out. Yeah. But it's more that just, knowing that we have a lot of listeners, and Donnie and I either teach or just know emerging writers who feel this pressure to publish. And rather than taking the time that a book needs. And sometimes it is a decade or more. So if you, and not necessarily if, because I'm sure you do, but when you talk to emerging writers, what advice do you have for them around any pressure they might feel, or this idea that it's publishing that validates you as a writer?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to, develop the writer, and, I think the right project will hopefully follow. I do think there's something to being, and I don't necessarily get into the weeds of this with my students, but I know, as much as I've showed up to a lot of interviews, and not including this interview because you haven't asked me this, but there's a lot of this kind of assumption that I'm like, I just showed up to write about my life because that's like all I have to say in book form. Like, this is just an autobiography that I've written. It definitely isn't. But I think there was a lot of strategy in terms of thinking about, well, where is there a gap in the market that I know that I can be impactful with my publication, and I can say, we haven't seen a book about Jamaicans from a Jamaican's perspective in Miami, from the second gen American, second gen immigrant perspective. And thinking about that, and thinking about what kind of book. Conversely, that is a market question, but maybe the better element of the decision making is like, what kind of book can you actually continue to show up in the event that your book takes 10 or 20 years to write? and what's going to, sustain you as the person who's showing up to write. For me, I know if I had been writing about subject matter that I just really didn't care about and I didn't think was important, then this would have been a project that I would have abandoned it in search of something else. So, developing yourself, your practice, thinking of it as a kind of practice, I think is helpful versus thinking of product. Mm-hmm. Also, I mean, there's something, it kind of depends where you are in the process, but I think planning for success can be a kind of good thing. I know as a story writer, part of that pressure that I felt over all those years was that if I was going to put out a story collection, even if I did have the book, it was kind of like, yeah, but where's your novel? Mm-hmm. So there was kind of this like, well, dang, I haven't even gotten the story collection published yet. And people are saying that even when I do, it's not going to be worth anything until I write a novel, so now I feel 2 steps behind. And so sometimes it's great to have, it's always great to have community. It's great to have people around you who might be, a half step ahead, 2 steps ahead, listening to their wisdom. It can be really good for you, but at the same time, like nobody can walk your path but you. And so like you might be that person who breaks new ground. I was very happy with my deal as a story writer. And so I even see ways in which I could have in my, not just my book, but just in my career, there's a way in which I kind of was down on myself because so many people were like, well, you just write stories versus like, you're not a novelist yet. You haven't graduated to being a novelist yet. And so, just believing in yourself, I suppose, having a kind of relentless determination is what is probably going to get you through. Yeah, I don't know. I tell my students a lot of things depending on the context.
Well, tell them you may have changed the game because, that more and more of us are coming out with our first books as story collections. At a certain point, we got to stop this nonsense that you got to have a novel because you just proved that's not true.
Right. I think so. Yeah. It's really weird when you're, and I don't know how either of you feel about this at the distance you are from putting your first books out, but I'm still like kind of in the throes, I think. And so I don't know, sometimes people say, oh, you're having a successful something the book is successful, or you're having a successful run or a successful debuting, and it's like I can't deny it, but at the same time I sometimes wonder like, oh, am I? Is it? Like, I don't know yet. Nobody, even when they do tell you are, I don't know if I believe it. I guess maybe I'm still waiting for my plaque or something to arrive in the mail to say like, you did it, kid.
I think some of us are just traumatized after a decade or more because, it's publishing is scary and there's so much rejection and we hear all these horror stories and you're kind of maybe waiting for the other shoe to drop. And what does success look like? Because there's so many measures, there's so many awards, there's so many lists, there's so many, and so it is hard to know where you kind of stand. But I think this is true of Donnie and it's true of me. One thing I know, and it sounds like you're doing the same thing, we just kept working. The book came out and we didn't stop. We just kept going, so... Yeah.
That's the best thing to do.
Right. Because I think sometimes
the work grounds you.
Right. Exactly. Does. And I think in other arenas, maybe something happens and it's a big success and you stop working because your work is like building, a ship or something. I don't know. But with writers, like we just keep going,
Yeah, you keep writing. And one thing really important, you keep reading as well. And so
absolutely.
One thing, Jonathan, I wanted to ask you, last question before we let you go. Where do you look for inspiration in terms of reading? Do you have a favorite story collection or any collections you've loved recently?
While I was writing the book, I read a lot of story collections that were kind of linked by character or theme, place, trying to just see what other authors have done. 2 books I return to a lot because of the way they're constructed, but also because of the powerful sentences, lean sentences, which I'm a fan of. At least I knew I wanted that for my first book anyway. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson is one that I've read over and over again. There are times when, I'll read a beautiful sentence and and I know exactly what the intention of the author is, and the the character who's saying it. And then sometimes it's like there's this almost slippery, like it's beautiful and I kind of understand it, but there's something that's just like a little bit out of reach. And I think the most perfect books are the books that are imperfect. They're imperfect. They strive for something that's just like beyond comprehension. And the other book I was going to mention is, I've heard Justin Torres say that it was constructed as a story collection, I believe, but it's published as a novel, which is We the Animals. And I talk about the book so much that I'm sure I'm going to get a cease and desist order at any moment now. But it's such beautiful writing about a family who has their problems, and those are some favorites for the the canon.
Love it. Well, Jonathan, this has been fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. I love what you're doing here. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. We will.
And we're looking forward to the next collection and Sonia and anything you do next. Everything
that's Sonia's story.
Keep us posted.
Fingers crossed, yes. I will.
And thanks everyone for joining us. If you like what we're doing at URSA, be sure to share this podcast with your friends. And if you'd like to support us directly, become an URSA member by going to ursastory.com/join. You'll help fund production of this show and keep us going. We'll see you next time.